This is a real story of a survivor of intimate partner violence. Jody identifies as an Indigenous deaf woman. She's an advocate for women with disabilities, especially deaf women. Her goal is to help them find access to services to find out about their health, as she has experience with being disregarded and disrespected by the legal system because of her identity as an Indigenous deaf woman living in a same-sex relationship. In the legal system, she was victimized and harassed by a man. When she collected evidence against her stalker, she was told she was invading his privacy. The police and courts began to take her seriously when other victims presented their own testimonies. When she persisted, she was interviewed, but without an interpreter. She wasn't sure of the language they used. She was told that her request for an interpreter was too expensive and time-consuming. They told her that her speech was great and they would slow down for her. She had to explain that while she could speak well and lip read, she needed an interpreter to give her the full context of their questions. They continued to use terminology that was unclear to her. She had to have court cases postponed and moved for all sorts of reasons, including not having an interpreter. The perpetrator claimed that he felt intimidated by the use of sign language and claimed they were talking in codes and telling lies. Even the judge didn't understand the bicultural, bilingual way in which she presented herself and criticized her for looking down and not directly at him, which is a sign of respect from her culture. Every time Jody had to give evidence, she had to relive the harassment and abuse caused by the stalker. Where was her right to a fair court hearing? Where was her right to support and to use her own language as a woman who needed protection? It is unrealistic to think the system is perfect. However, there are several gaps in it. Not that women with disabilities should get special treatment, but they have the right to have just, fair, and appropriate support services, a clear understanding of the laws, and an awareness of who the key players are in the court process and who will eventually provide them protection. Let's look at the ways in which Jody was institutionally disadvantaged by the systems in place to supposedly help her. Jody identifies as an Indigenous woman. Indigenous people are often treated as second-class citizens in our society. They are often not believed or listened to by people in positions of power. Indigenous people and their cultures have been critiqued and laughed at by mainstream culture as a form of oppression since the first colonization of Indigenous land. This stigma can prevent Indigenous people from being valued as equal, valuable, and credible in regards to mainstream culture and practices. Jody is also in a same-sex relationship, which is often stigmatized as unjust, sinful, and hypersexualized, particularly among some followers of religion. The homophobic stereotypes in our society can interfere with how seriously Jody is taken, in the sense that the stigma inflicts the idea that same-sex relationships are inhuman and not real love. People could base Jody's credibility on predispositions they have stemmed from homophobia. Jody also faces prejudice as someone with a disability. People in the deaf community are taken advantage of and marginalized by mainstream hearing society. The deaf community faces discrimination and oppression as they are often not prioritized for jobs and education due to the misconception that their accommodations are too costly. Jody was denied an interpreter for this reason. It is also hard for Jody, as it is often assumed that deaf people can fluently read lips, which is impossible, and that they have a high proficiency in English, which is often not the case. Ideally, her story would sound more like this.
Jody was victimized and harassed by a man. He stole her ability to do simple things, to go out in public without fear and to visit her friends. She decided to take a stand. She went to the police and provided written and video documentation of the man's harassment and stalking. Upon seeing this evidence, they believed her. This man had undoubtedly violated her privacy and the privacy of other victims as well. They believed he needed to be brought to justice immediately. As an Indigenous woman, Jodi was familiar with the ways in which Indigenous people are oppressed in society, and how colonization has created a stigma that prevents Indigenous people from being valued as equal. Thankfully, law enforcement had been involved in a rigorous training program centered around the improvement of social environments to facilitate reporting and trust between themselves and survivors, so they were aware of their own potential racial bias. By using an interpreter, she would be able to understand the full context of their questions, as well as the English terminology they used. Her court cases moved swiftly. They knew Jodi was a woman who needed protection, and someone who certainly deserved a fair court hearing. Working with a highly trained local team with expertise related to this kind of victimization, officials were taught that Jodi would have to relive her traumatic experiences if they postponed or moved her court cases. They wanted the process to be survivor-centered and compassionate. Moreover, they learned that it was possible Jodi's abuser would become more dangerous following her reporting, and they wanted to hold him accountable as soon as possible. What Jodi went through was unspeakably difficult, but in this story, she was given access to resources that made the process of navigating the system smoother. Through the use of training programs and the development of teams trained to handle intimate partner violence, stalking, and sexual violence victimization, authorities and advocates were made aware of how they could respect Jodi's identities, make her voice heard, and put an end to her abuse.